Most of what you've heard about medieval times is complete nonsense. Hollywood loves showing dirty peasants cowering from witch hunts. But here's the twist. The real medieval world was far stranger than any movie could imagine. We're talking about a 1,000-year span from 476 to 1453 CE, covering everything from the fall of Rome to the rise of the Renaissance. And in that time, people did things that would land them in prison today, or worse. Some practices were born from desperate attempts at medicine. Others came from twisted ideas about justice. A few were just pure insanity dressed up as tradition. But all of them reveal a world where the line between civilization and chaos was razor thin. Get ready to discover 10 medieval practices so bizarre, so shocking, that they'll make you grateful you live in the 21st century. The real question isn't whether these practices were weird, it's how entire civilizations thought they made perfect sense. Imagine walking into a medieval hospital with a headache and walking out. Well, not walking out at all. For over 700 years, from the 9th to the 16th century, European doctors had one solution to almost every medical problem. Drain your blood until you felt better, or until you died, whichever came first. This wasn't some fringe practice by village quacks. We're talking about the medical establishment across France, Italy, England, and beyond. University-trained physicians at prestigious institutions like the Medical School of Salerno, Europe's first medical school, taught bloodletting as scientific fact. The logic seemed sound to them. Ancient Greek physician Galen claimed the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood made you sick, so obviously you needed to let some out. Medieval doctors took this theory and ran with it straight into mass medical malpractice. Here's how they did it. Slice open a vein with a lancet, attach leeches to suck blood out, or use a heated glass cup to literally vacuum blood from your skin. Patients would lie there, watching their life force drain into bowls while doctors nodded approvingly. The worst part, it actually seemed to work sometimes. Bloodletting can temporarily reduce blood pressure, making feverish patients feel momentarily better before they crashed. This false positive kept the practice alive for centuries. King Charles II of England received this treatment in 1685. His doctors drained nearly 2 pints of blood from him while he was having a stroke. Spoiler alert, it didn't help. He died anyway, probably faster than he would have otherwise. Even George Washington got the bloodletting treatment in 1799 for a throat infection. His doctors drained nearly 40% of his blood in less than 24 hours. Modern estimates suggest he died from shock and blood loss, not the original infection. The practice finally started dying out in the 19th century, when doctors realized their cure was killing more people than the diseases they were treating. But by then, bloodletting had claimed countless lives across medieval Europe, all in the name of scientific medicine. Here's a truth bomb that'll shatter everything you think you know about medieval witch hunts. They barely happened. The image of torch-wielding medieval peasants burning old women at the stake? Complete fantasy. The real witch hunt craze occurred centuries later, and the people doing most of the burning weren't superstitious Catholics. They were educated Protestants. Medieval Catholic authorities actually thought witch hunting was ridiculous superstition. The Council of Paderborn in 785 CE flat out banned punishing women for flying with the devil, calling it pagan nonsense. For most of the Middle Ages, claiming someone was a witch could get you in trouble with the church, not the accused witch. The real witch hunt madness exploded between 1550 and 1650, well into the Renaissance and Reformation era. This wasn't ignorant medieval darkness, this was supposedly enlightened early modern Europe going completely insane. Protestant regions, especially in Germany, went absolutely berserk. The German states executed an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 people for witchcraft, more than the rest of Europe combined. Catholic areas like Spain and Italy, their numbers were tiny in comparison. Why the difference? Protestant theology emphasized personal relationships with God and Satan, making individual devil worship seem more threatening. Catholic doctrine, with its elaborate hierarchy and ritual protections, made witchcraft seem less urgent. The most brutal witch hunts happened in places like Würzburg and Bamberg in Bavaria, where Protestant-influenced Catholic bishops competed to prove their religious purity. Prince Bishop Julius Ector of Würzburg burned over 900 people between 1626 and 1631. That's more witch executions than most entire medieval centuries combined. Scotland went particularly mad under Protestant influence. Between 1563 and 1736, Scottish courts executed around 4,000 people for witchcraft. King James VI of Scotland literally wrote a book about hunting witches before becoming King James I of England. You don't learn this in history classes out there. But the witch hunting stereotype comes from deliberate Protestant propaganda aimed at making Catholic medieval times look barbaric. The irony? Protestants did most of the actual witch burning. By the time the medieval period ended in 1453, witch hunts were barely a footnote. The real horror show started when supposedly rational Renaissance thinkers decided old superstitions weren't superstitious enough. Medieval courts had a unique approach to justice. If you can't prove someone's guilt, just torture them and see if God intervenes. Welcome to trial by ordeal, where divine judgment met human sadism in the most twisted legal system ever devised. From the 9th to 13th centuries across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, courts literally used torture as a method of determining innocence or guilt. The logic was beautifully insane. God knew everything, right? So if someone was truly innocent, surely the Almighty would perform a miracle to save them from harm. If they suffered or died during the ordeal, well, obviously they were guilty and deserved it. The ordeal of hot iron was a crowd favorite. Accused criminals had to carry a red-hot iron bar 9 feet while barefoot. Afterward, priests would bandage their hands and examine them 3 days later. If the burns were healing miraculously, you were innocent. If they looked infected or severe, congratulations, you were guilty and probably about to be executed. Then there was the ordeal of cold water, which had a cruel catch-22 built right in. They'd tie up the accused and throw them into a river or pond. If you sank, you were innocent, but also probably drowned, so good luck enjoying your vindication. If you floated, the water had rejected you as guilty, and they'd fish you out just to execute you properly. Some accused people chose trial by combat instead, which meant fighting to the death against their accuser or a professional champion, because apparently medieval justice system designers thought, you know what this needs? More violence. The ordeal of boiling water forced accused thieves to plunge their bare hands into scalding water to retrieve a stone from the bottom. The depth varied by the severity of the crime. Wrist deep for minor theft, elbow deep for major crimes. Burns that healed cleanly meant innocence. Festering wounds meant guilt and punishment. Here's the darkest part. These ordeals often worked exactly as intended, just not how you'd expect. Many innocent people, terrified by the process, would confess to crimes they didn't commit rather than face potential torture and death. The ordeal served as medieval plea bargaining through terror. The practice finally ended when Pope Innocent III banned clergy participation in ordeals at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Without priests to oversee the divine element, the whole system collapsed. Courts gradually shifted toward jury trials and inquisitorial procedures. Actually trying to determine facts instead of hoping for miracles. But for over 400 years, medieval justice operated on the principle that the best way to determine truth was to see how much pain someone could endure without divine intervention. Medieval courts didn't just prosecute humans for crimes. They literally put animals on trial, complete with judges, juries, and defense attorneys. This isn't some isolated weirdness that happened once. From the 13th to 17th centuries, European courts regularly prosecuted animals for everything from theft to murder to disturbing the peace. France alone recorded over 200 animal trials, with cases documented in Italy, Switzerland, and across the Holy Roman Empire. The most famous case happened in Falaise, France in 1386. A pig attacked and killed a human infant. The court didn't just slaughter the pig, they gave it a full criminal trial. The pig was formally accused, assigned a defense lawyer, and tried before a judge and jury. After deliberation, they found the pig guilty of murder and sentenced it to death by hanging in the public square. But here's where it gets even weirder. They dressed the pig in human clothes for the execution. The court records show they spent money on a man's jacket, breeches, and even white gloves for the pig's front hooves. The idea was that if the pig committed a human crime, it should die like a human criminal. Other animals faced trial for equally bizarre reasons. In 1519, a French court prosecuted field mice for destroying crops. The mice obviously couldn't appear in person, so the court appointed a defense attorney to represent them. The lawyer argued that his clients were too young to understand the law and that God had given them natural rights to sustenance. Swiss courts went even further with their animal prosecutions. In 1478, they put beetle larvae on trial for damaging crops. The court issued formal summons requiring the insects to appear before the tribunal. When the beetles failed to show up, they were tried in absentia and officially banished from the territory. Some animal trials lasted for years. In 1587, the French village of Saint-Julien spent several years prosecuting weevils for crop damage. The insects were assigned 2 different defense attorneys during the lengthy proceedings. The lawyers argued that the weevils were simply following God's natural law and shouldn't be punished for their instincts. The legal reasoning behind these trials reveals medieval thinking about crime and responsibility. Church doctrine taught that all of God's creatures had souls and could choose between good and evil. If animals could sin, they could also be held accountable for their actions in court. Courts distinguished between wild animals acting on instinct and domestic animals that should know better. Pigs, cows, and horses faced harsher sentences because they lived among humans and were expected to follow human moral codes. The practice finally died out in the 17th century as legal systems became more sophisticated and religious views of animal consciousness shifted. But for over 400 years, European courts treated animal crimes with the same seriousness as human felonies, complete with legal representation, formal procedures, and public executions. Medieval parents loved their children just as much as modern parents do. The problem, their childcare practices were essentially a recipe for infant mortality. Between 20% and 50% of medieval children died before their 5th birthday, and many of those deaths came from well-intentioned parenting decisions that were slowly poisoning kids. From France to England to the Italian states, medieval baby care combined ignorance, superstition, and outright dangerous medical advice. Let's start with feeding practices that would horrify modern pediatricians. Wealthy families hired wet nurses to breastfeed their babies, but they chose these women based on bizarre criteria. Medieval medical texts claim that a wet nurse's moral character would transfer through her milk to the baby. Courts spent serious money finding nurses who were not only healthy, but also virtuous, temperate, and preferably blonde, because apparently hair color affected milk quality. The screening process was insane. Potential wet nurses had to prove their milk was the right consistency, color, and even taste. Doctors would examine the milk by dropping it on their fingernails to see how it spread. Too thick meant the nurse was too passionate. Too thin meant she was weak-willed. Poor families couldn't afford wet nurses, so they improvised with deadly alternatives. Babies as young as a few weeks old were fed mixtures of water, honey, and wine. Yes, wine. Because medieval doctors believed alcohol would strengthen infant constitutions. Other popular infant foods included bread soaked in wine or ale, cow's milk mixed with honey, and various herb concoctions that were often toxic. Medieval swaddling practices were essentially infant torture devices. Babies were wrapped so tightly in cloth strips that they couldn't move their arms or legs for months. The idea was that loose limbs would grow crooked, so children needed to be bound like little mummies. Many babies developed respiratory problems or circulation issues from being essentially immobilized for their first year of life. Then, there was the medieval approach to infant hygiene, which ranged from neglectful to dangerous. Babies were rarely bathed because water was considered harmful to infant skin. Instead, parents would rub babies with salt or wine to cleanse them. Dirty diapers were often left unchanged for days because frequent diaper changes were thought to make children weak and overly sensitive. Medieval medicine had specific treatments for common infant ailments that often made things worse. Teething babies were given coral necklaces to chew on, or had their gums rubbed with animal fat mixed with honey. Colicky infants were given opium-based syrups that often led to overdoses. The most tragic part was how medieval parents rationalized these massive death rates. High infant mortality was seen as God's will, leading to a fatalistic acceptance that prevented medical improvements. Many parents didn't even name their children until they survived their first year, expecting death as the default outcome. Religious practices added another layer of danger. Holy relics were pressed against sick babies, often spreading infections between families. Pilgrimages to healing shrines exposed infants to diseases from crowds of other sick people seeking cures. This wasn't malice or neglect. It was an entire civilization doing its best with catastrophically wrong information. Medieval parents followed the medical advice of their time, consulted religious authorities, and hired the best childcare help they could afford. The results were devastating, but the intentions were loving. The infant mortality crisis only began improving in the late medieval period as medical knowledge slowly advanced and basic hygiene practices evolved. But for centuries, medieval childhood was essentially a survival lottery with terrible odds. Everything you think you know about medieval hygiene is backwards. Those dirty medieval peasants, they actually bathed more regularly than most people realize, until the plague made them terrified of water. The stereotype of filthy medieval Europeans comes from later periods, not the Middle Ages themselves. Early medieval people were actually quite concerned with cleanliness, especially compared to what came after. During the High Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common across European cities. Paris had over 30 public baths by the 13th century. London, Bruges, and German cities like Nuremberg had thriving bathhouse industries. These weren't just basic washing facilities. They were social centers with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and professional attendants. Medieval people understood the connection between cleanliness and health better than their reputation suggests. Religious texts emphasized spiritual cleanliness through physical cleanliness. Monasteries had elaborate washing facilities, and monks were required to bathe regularly. The rule of St. Benedict specifically mandated frequent bathing for health reasons. Wealthy households had private bathing chambers with wooden tubs that servants would fill with heated water. Perfumed soaps made from animal fats and herbs were luxury items, but they existed and were widely used among the upper classes. Even peasants had access to soap made from ash and animal fat, but then the Black Death changed everything. The plague pandemic of 1347 to 1351 killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population, and terrified survivors started connecting disease transmission with bathhouses and communal bathing. Medical authorities began claiming that water opened the body's pores, making people vulnerable to bad air and disease. This wasn't entirely wrong. Medieval bathhouses could spread diseases through contaminated water and close contact, but the response was extreme. By 1400, many cities had closed their public baths. People shifted from regular bathing to what they called dry cleaning, changing undergarments frequently and using perfumed cloths to wipe their skin. The anti-bathing movement gained religious support when some church authorities began preaching that excessive concern with bodily cleanliness was vanity and distracted from spiritual matters. Saints who never bathed became models of holy behavior, though this was more about extreme asceticism than general church policy. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europeans had developed elaborate alternatives to bathing that seem bizarre today. Instead of washing their bodies, people focused obsessively on clean linen. The wealthy changed their shirts daily and used the white fabric to absorb body oils and dirt. Having multiple clean shirts became a status symbol, visible proof that you could afford regular laundry. Perfumes and scented powders masked body odors instead of eliminating them. The wealthy doused themselves in expensive fragrances made from exotic spices and flowers. Pomanders, decorative containers filled with aromatic herbs, were carried to ward off bad smells and supposedly prevent disease. Hair care became equally strange. Since full-body bathing was suspect, people washed their hair separately, sometimes only monthly. Wealthy women used elaborate headdresses and wigs to hide unwashed hair, while men often wore hats constantly to conceal greasy locks. The irony is that this post-medieval hygiene decline created the dirty Middle Ages stereotype. Renaissance and early modern Europeans, who had largely abandoned regular bathing, projected their own uncleanliness backwards onto medieval people. Victorian historians amplified this myth to make their own era seem more civilized by comparison. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Medieval settlements show sophisticated drainage systems, latrines positioned away from water sources, and specialized areas for washing clothes and bodies. Soap production was an established medieval industry with guild regulations and quality standards. The real medieval hygiene crisis wasn't about ignorance, it was about fear. A civilization that had embraced cleanliness abandoned it when disease made water seem dangerous. The result was centuries of actual filthiness that people incorrectly blame on the medieval period that had cleaner habits. Medieval public executions weren't grim, solemn affairs. They were the biggest entertainment events of the year, complete with vendors, carnival atmosphere, and cheering crowds. From the 10th to the 18th centuries across Europe, public executions drew massive audiences who treated brutal deaths like modern sporting events. Towns would declare execution days as public holidays. Schools closed, markets shut down, and entire communities gathered to watch people die in the most horrific ways imaginable. The execution of criminals became elaborate theatrical productions. Different crimes called for different methods of death, each designed for maximum spectacle and suffering. Hanging was for common thieves, beheading for nobles, burning for heretics, and more creative tortures for particularly heinous crimes. Take the execution of William Wallace in London in 1305. The Scottish rebel was hanged until almost dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive. His organs were burned before his eyes, then he was beheaded and his body cut into quarters. The crowd loved every minute of it, cheering each stage of the torture. Vendors set up food stalls around execution sites like medieval concession stands. People bought bread, ale, and roasted meat to enjoy while watching criminals die. Pickpockets worked the crowds, ironically committing crimes punishable by death while watching others get executed for similar offenses. The best viewing spots were sold like premium tickets. Wealthy spectators paid for platform seats or balcony views of the gallows. Some executions drew crowds of 10,000 or more in major cities. The 1660 execution of the regicides who had signed King Charles II's death warrant drew massive crowds who treated it like a festival celebrating royal revenge. Executioners became celebrity figures with loyal followings. Skilled headsmen who could decapitate someone cleanly with one stroke were praised and rewarded by appreciative crowds. Clumsy executioners who needed multiple swings were booed and sometimes attacked by angry spectators who felt cheated of a good show. The condemned often played their part in the performance. Many gave final speeches to the crowd, either confessing their crimes or proclaiming their innocence. Some cracked jokes or showed defiant bravery that earned audience approval. Others broke down and begged for mercy, which the crowd usually found entertaining rather than sympathetic. Burning at the stake was particularly popular because it took longer and provided more dramatic spectacle. The execution of heretics like Joan of Arc drew enormous crowds who came to see religious enemies suffer divine punishment. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the carnival atmosphere of vendors and entertainment. Children weren't shielded from these events. They were encouraged to attend as moral education. Parents brought entire families to watch executions, believing that seeing the consequences of crime would prevent their children from becoming criminals. Schools organized field trips to public hangings. Souvenirs were big business around execution sites. Pieces of the rope used for hanging were sold as good luck charms. Executioners auctioned off the clothes of the condemned. Some entrepreneurs sold authentic relics that were supposedly connected to famous executions, though most were probably fake. The crowd participation was intense and sometimes got out of hand. Spectators would throw rotten food at unpopular criminals or cheer for those they sympathized with. Sometimes crowds tried to rescue popular prisoners or attack those they particularly hated before the official execution could take place. This wasn't considered barbaric at the time. It was seen as necessary public education and righteous entertainment. Medieval people believed that visible punishment deterred crime and that public participation in justice strengthened community moral bonds. The practice only began declining in the 18th and 19th centuries as ideas about public decency and the purpose of punishment evolved. But for nearly 800 years, medieval Europe turned death into mass entertainment that would make modern horror movies seem tame by comparison. The medieval Catholic Church literally sold salvation for cash, not metaphorically. They had actual price lists for forgiveness. Welcome to the indulgence system, where papal authority met medieval capitalism in the most profitable scam in religious history. From the 14th to 16th centuries, the church sold certificates promising reduced time in purgatory or complete forgiveness of sins, depending on how much you could afford to pay. The business model was brilliantly simple. Church doctrine taught that even forgiven sins required punishment in purgatory before reaching heaven. But the church claimed to possess a treasury of merit, excess good deeds from Jesus, Mary, and the saints that could be transferred to regular sinners through papal authority. For the right price, you could buy years off your purgatory sentence. The church published official rate sheets showing exactly how much salvation cost. In Germany, a basic indulgence covering minor sins might cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a craftsman. Full plenary indulgences that wiped out all punishment could cost months of income. Pope Leo X took this system to outrageous extremes to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He authorized aggressive sales campaigns across Europe, with professional indulgence salesmen working territories like medieval insurance agents. The most notorious was Johann Tetzel, whose sales pitch in Germany became legendary. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The pricing got increasingly creative and disturbing. You could buy indulgences not just for your own sins, but for dead relatives already suffering in purgatory. Parents bought indulgences for deceased children. Some certificates even covered future sins. Spiritual credit cards that let you sin first and pay later. Different sins had different prices in what amounted to a medieval moral marketplace. Murder cost more than theft. Adultery had premium pricing. Some indulgences came with bulk discounts for families or group purchases by guilds and confraternities. The sales tactics would make modern telemarketers blush. Indulgence peddlers used fear-based marketing, describing in graphic detail the torments of purgatory and the relief that money could buy. They set up in marketplaces and town squares, complete with bells, banners, and theatrical presentations about eternal damnation. Church authorities justified this commerce by claiming the money-funded holy works, building churches, supporting hospitals, financing crusades against Muslim territories. But much of the profit went to papal luxury and Italian politics. The sale of indulgences helped fund Renaissance art and architecture while emptying the pockets of ordinary believers. The system created obvious moral hazards. Wealthy sinners could literally buy their way into heaven, while poor people faced eternal punishment for identical crimes. Some nobles purchased indulgences in advance, treating them like licenses to commit future sins without spiritual consequences. Local priests often opposed the indulgence trade because it undermined their authority and reduced donations to local churches. Many complained that parishioners stopped confessing sins or doing penance, believing that purchased forgiveness was superior to spiritual effort. The practice reached peak absurdity when Pope Julius II sold indulgences to fund military campaigns against other Christians. People could buy salvation while the church used their money to wage war against fellow Catholics in Italian territorial disputes. Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses in 1517 specifically targeted indulgence abuse, launching the Protestant Reformation partly as a reaction against commercialized salvation. Luther argued that the church had no authority to sell God's grace, and that the entire system corrupted Christian doctrine. The Council of Trent finally reformed indulgence practices in the 1560s, banning their sale and restricting their use. But for over 200 years, the medieval church operated what was essentially a spiritual protection racket, selling divine forgiveness to the highest bidder. In medieval Europe, looking up at the wrong time could send entire kingdoms into panic. Eclipses, comets, and unusual celestial events weren't scientific phenomena. They were divine telegrams announcing imminent disaster. Medieval people lived in constant fear of the sky turning against them. Every unusual astronomical event triggered mass hysteria, military campaigns, and sometimes the collapse of entire governments. The heavens were God's billboard, and the message was usually prepare to die. The solar eclipse of August 2nd, 1133, terrorized England so completely that it changed the course of royal succession. King Henry I died just 2 years later, and chroniclers immediately connected his death to the eclipse that had supposedly foretold it. The panic over the eclipse's meaning contributed to the civil war that followed Henry's death, as nobles interpreted the astronomical event as divine disapproval of various succession claims. Halley's comet in 1066 caused even more dramatic political consequences. The comet appeared just months before the Norman invasion of England, and both Saxons and Normans saw it as an omen. The Saxons interpreted it as a warning of coming disaster, which proved accurate when they lost the Battle of Hastings. The Normans claimed it was a sign of their divine right to conquer England. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts terrified Englishmen pointing at the comet while Norman soldiers prepare for invasion. Medieval courts employed professional astrologers who turned skywatching into a lucrative career. These weren't charlatans. They were educated scholars who combined astronomical observation with astrological interpretation. Royal astrologers advised kings on when to start wars, sign treaties, or even get married based on celestial movements. The appearance of comets triggered some of the most extreme reactions. The comet of 1456 was so bright and persistent that Pope Calixtus III officially excommunicated it as an agent of the devil. Church bells rang across Europe to ward off the comet's evil influence, and special prayers were composed to protect Christians from celestial malevolence. Lunar eclipses caused different but equally intense panics. Medieval people understood that lunar eclipses occurred when the Earth's shadow covered the moon, but they interpreted this as dragons or demons literally devouring the moon. Entire communities would bang pots, ring bells, and shout to scare away the monsters attacking the moon. The year 1000 CE saw widespread apocalyptic panic, partly triggered by a series of unusual astronomical events. Chroniclers recorded multiple comets, eclipses, and meteor showers that coincided with millennial fears about the end of the world. Some nobles gave away their property to monasteries, believing that Judgment Day was imminent based on heavenly signs. Military commanders used astronomical fears as psychological warfare. Knowing that enemies would interpret eclipses as bad omens, some generals timed attacks to coincide with celestial events. The Byzantine general Nicephorus Phocas reportedly planned several campaigns around eclipses, knowing that Muslim armies would be demoralized by what they saw as divine warnings. Medieval chroniclers obsessively recorded every unusual sky event, creating detailed catalogs of comets, eclipses, auroras, and meteor showers. These weren't scientific observations. They were intelligence reports about divine intentions. Monasteries maintained astronomical records primarily to decode God's messages about earthly politics. The aurora borealis terrified medieval Europeans who lived too far south to see it regularly. When unusual solar activity pushed the northern lights further south, people interpreted the dancing lights as armies of angels fighting in heaven or as fires announcing the apocalypse. The aurora of 1204 was so unusual and widespread that chroniclers across Europe recorded it as a supernatural battle in the sky. Even regular planetary movements caused anxiety when they formed unusual configurations. Medieval astrologers calculated great conjunctions when multiple planets appeared close together, interpreting these events as cosmic emergencies requiring immediate political action. Kings would delay important decisions for months, waiting for planetary alignments to improve. The irony is that medieval universities actually had sophisticated astronomical knowledge inherited from Islamic scholars and ancient Greek texts, but this scientific understanding coexisted with astrological interpretation that turned every celestial event into a political crisis. Scholars could accurately predict eclipses while simultaneously believing that those eclipses were divine warnings about specific earthly events. Medieval courts had the ultimate dispute resolution system. When evidence wasn't clear, they'd let the parties fight to the death and assume God would ensure the righteous person won. Trial by combat turned legal proceedings into gladiatorial spectacles from the 8th to 14th centuries across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. This wasn't vigilante justice or street fighting. It was an official legal procedure sanctioned by kings and conducted under strict court supervision. The logic was theologically bulletproof to medieval minds. If God was omniscient and just, surely he would intervene in mortal combat to ensure that truth prevailed. The winner was obviously innocent, and the loser got what divine justice determined they deserved. The most famous trial by combat in medieval history occurred in France in 1386, involving Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris. Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife, Marguerite. When witnesses couldn't prove the case either way, King Charles VI authorized a judicial duel to determine the truth. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Carouge lost, Legris would be declared innocent, and Marguerite would be burned alive for making false accusations under oath. If Legris lost, he would die, and Carouge would be vindicated. Marguerite's life literally depended on her husband's fighting skills. Thousands of spectators gathered at the Abbey of Saint-Martin-des-Champs to watch the duel. Both men fought on horseback with lances, then continued on foot with swords and daggers. Carouges eventually killed Legris, proving his wife's innocence through superior combat skills. The crowd cheered divine justice in action. The rules for trial by combat were surprisingly elaborate and formal. Courts appointed marshals to oversee the fights, established specific weapons allowed for different types of cases, and even regulated what prayers combatants could say before fighting. Some regions had different combat rules for nobles versus commoners, clergy versus laypeople, and men versus women. Women presented a particular challenge to the combat system since they rarely fought personally. Instead, they could appoint male champions to fight on their behalf. Professional fighters made careers out of serving as champions for people who couldn't or wouldn't fight themselves. These champions swore oaths that they believed in their client's innocence and were fighting for truth. Not everyone was allowed to demand trial by combat. Accused parties had to be free men of good standing. Serfs, criminals, and people with certain physical disabilities were excluded. The logic was that God only honored combat requests from people worthy of divine intervention. Some trials by combat lasted for hours, as evenly matched opponents fought to exhaustion. Others ended quickly when one combatant gained an early advantage. Courts sometimes stopped fights before death if one participant yielded, or was clearly defeated, though yielding usually meant accepting guilt and punishment. The practice created obvious problems that medieval legal authorities gradually recognized. Skilled fighters could literally get away with murder by defeating their accusers in combat. Weak or elderly defendants faced almost certain death, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Professional champions complicated the system further by creating a market for combat services. Wealthy defendants could hire the best fighters, while poor accusers had to rely on their own limited skills. This essentially turned divine justice into an auction where the highest bidder could purchase combat superiority. Some defendants tried to game the system through creative interpretations of combat rules. They might challenge accusers to fight with unusual weapons they specialized in, or demand combat conditions that favored their particular skills. Courts had to develop increasingly detailed regulations to prevent combat manipulation. The church gradually turned against trial by combat as theological understanding evolved. Religious authorities began questioning whether God really intervened in human disputes through physical violence, especially when obviously guilty skilled fighters kept defeating obviously innocent weak opponents. The practice finally died out in most of Europe by the 15th century as legal systems developed more sophisticated evidence-gathering techniques. But for over 600 years, medieval justice operated on the principle that the best way to determine truth was to see who could kill whom in a sanctified fight to the death. The last recorded trial by combat in France occurred in 1547, centuries after most regions had abandoned the practice. By then, it was seen as a barbaric relic of a less civilized age, though medieval people had considered it the pinnacle of divine justice. The Middle Ages weren't the ignorant dark period Hollywood wants you to believe. They were 1,000 years of humans trying to make sense of a world they didn't fully understand, using the best knowledge available to them. Sometimes that knowledge was catastrophically wrong. Medieval people weren't more cruel or stupid than us. They were working with different information, different beliefs, and different survival pressures. They loved their children just as much as modern parents do. They just had deadly wrong ideas about how to keep them alive. The real lesson here isn't that medieval people were barbaric. It's that every civilization operates on assumptions that seem obviously correct at the time, but look insane to future generations. Someday, people will probably look back at our practices with the same horror we feel about bloodletting and trial by combat. What's the most shocking practice you discovered today? Drop a comment and let us know which medieval crime surprised you the most, and what modern practice you think future generations will judge us for.